Story 1. Do not allow companies like BlackRock to hold single-family homes as real estate investments. They may invest in building homes, but should sell them once they are completed. Foreign companies, including Chinese firms, should not own American homes. Relax some building regulations as well. Story 2. Stop calling yourselves middle class and realize you are working class. Story 3. There needs to be an overhaul of zoning laws. Many places make it difficult to build or increase housing density. As young people move to urban areas for higher-paying jobs, the cost of housing is high because supply is artificially constrained. This creates ripple effects that extend into the suburbs. Story 4. The only thing that will bring prices down is more housing. That does not mean affordable housing. It simply means increased housing supply. Story 5. 2 words. Increased supply. This is basic economics. Demand is very high and supply must meet it. Story 6. National Public Radio covered this issue. The key is zoning reform. We need more housing in general, especially high-density housing such as condominiums and apartments. If we can build more housing, even if it is not single-family homes, there will be downward pressure on single-family home prices because there will be more viable alternatives. To address the not-in-my-backyard problem that prevents this from happening naturally, federal funding and aid can be conditioned on local zoning reform so that communities are incentivized to allow higher density development. To reduce construction costs and increase building activity, the United States needs more lumber than it currently produces, so tariffs on Canadian lumber should be reduced. Finally, tax incentives could encourage sales to first-time homebuyers and conversions of office space to housing, making these options more economically viable. Story 7. Build a vast number of new housing units, equivalent to the number of homes in Phoenix, across the United States. Include starter homes, multifamily units, traditional single-family houses, and large homes. Story 8. Prohibiting hedge funds and private equity firms from purchasing homes would be a good start. Story 9. It is supply and demand. Supply is fixed or slow-growing because of regulation, supply chain constraints, construction time, and zoning laws. Demand is growing due to people coming of age, population increases from immigration, and investors opening short-term rentals such as Airbnb. Story 10. We need the same kind of housing expansion that the baby boomers benefited from after World War II. The country does not have enough housing. A national investment in housing and putting people to work to build for the betterment of all seems like such an obvious dual positive, so of course it will never happen. Story 11. There are 2 aspects to this question. 1. There are many places where a middle-class family can afford a house on a 40-hour-per-week income. They are rarely in New England or on the West Coast. The pay cut when moving from San Francisco to, say, St. Louis is a smaller percentage than the reduction in living costs. For example, the median salary in San Francisco is $104,000 versus $56,000 in St. Louis, while the median housing cost in San Francisco is $1.4 million versus $227,000 in St. Louis. Salaries are about half, but housing costs are about 84% lower. 2. In high-cost-of-living areas, limiting speculative housing ownership and short-term rentals would help. These factors have been among the biggest drivers of housing costs. Addressing zoning to allow more mixed-use and multifamily housing would also increase supply. Story 12. A widespread zoning change is needed to allow denser multifamily buildings. We need many 1- to 2-bedroom condominiums and townhomes. Historically, those were starter ownership opportunities because they tend to be smaller. But most places make them difficult to build, so large corporations build apartment complexes where they can and no longer bother to build condominiums because they earn more from rentals. I am 53, and it was possible in my 20s to buy a small condominium on a regular salary. Those days are gone. We overreacted severely to the 2008 real estate bubble. We stopped building for 3 years and have not been able to catch up to demand. Story 13. Build more housing units. Reduce regulatory costs for new construction and limit local opposition to new development and zoning restrictions. Prohibit corporate ownership of residential property. Only individuals may own homes, and limit the number of properties an individual can own. This will greatly reduce speculation and increases in property values driven by investment. Increase workers' wages, which have not kept pace with inflation for a long time. Create government programs to subsidize first-time home buyers so they can more easily qualify for a home. Story 14. The top upvoted replies you see are precisely the reason we will not have affordable housing anytime soon. Story 15. Stop seeing homes as commodities to profit from. Instead, see them as something we all intrinsically need. Story 16. We, as a species, must stop serving the interests of the mega-rich, the evil, and the corrupt. Story 17. Build more housing. Home prices rise because many people have enough money to pay higher prices. Investment companies buy houses because they expect rents and housing costs to keep increasing. Building housing at an appropriate level, similar to how we produce food or water, will not happen because millions of people have their retirement tied to the hope that their house will increase in value by 3% per year. Story 18. A plan to build many more houses and financial breaks for first-time homeowners. Story 19. You all need unions to improve your wages, so vote for politicians who care about these issues. Story 20. Property prices are not facing just a crash but a fundamental reboot, which means they will grow or shrink with inflation and will not rise into the stratosphere. Story 21. Limit investment and foreign ownership in housing. Story 22. Revisit Citizens United. Where money is treated as speech, some people have more money and use it to disguise the source of that speech. Currently, wealthy individuals spend money to convince low-income people to support candidates who say they will cut public services to pay for tax cuts for ultra-rich households. And many voters do not know their votes and opinions are being manipulated. Story 23. Corporate tax rates need to return to the levels of the 1950s. Story 24. People who insist that moving solves the problem should realize that jobs are concentrated in hubs. Meatpacking plants are clustered in certain areas, and financial firms are concentrated in others. Even technology companies did not sustain the luxury of working from anywhere and are implementing return-to-office mandates. You need to live where the jobs are. What the government can do is try to eliminate hubs. For physical goods, this will be impossible, but for the digital economy, it is more feasible. Do not assume the next financial technology company must be in New York or that the next tech startup must be in San Francisco or Seattle. The government should incentivize locating these industries and their employees in other regions. Right now, there is very little incentive for skilled employees to move to areas with a low cost of living. Companies are not there, and the government gives no incentives for the move. Story 25. Financial literacy needs to be taught, and people need to stop trying to keep up with the Joneses. I do not say this in a judgmental way. I work in finance and I see people who earn six-figure incomes but can barely pay their bills due to overspending on things they do not need or misplaced priorities. This also requires accountability and asking for help, which is difficult for many people. Story 26. Your location matters. There are many places in the United States where that is possible. Rural areas with significant manufacturing are usually very affordable and often offer high wages to attract workers. Story 27. Build many more housing units and eliminate zoning laws that prohibit them. Story 28. Several things in no particular order. Fewer people or corporations should own multiple single-family homes as long-term or short-term rentals. Wages should be higher. People should have the ability and willingness to move to areas with abundant affordable housing. That is how I was able to buy a house. Story 29. Make the minimum wage equal to what it was when first established, adjusted for inflation. Right now, the minimum wage is so low that many people cannot afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment in any state in the United States without government assistance, a roommate, or a partner. Originally, the minimum wage was intended to support a family of 3 on a single income and to leave enough to save for retirement and to buy a house. Story 30. Higher prices for goods due to tariffs, renewed inflation, and tax cuts for the rich. Story 31. How do you define the middle class? I believe someone earning a decent income can afford to buy a house. Story 32. Ban corporations and foreign nationals from buying single-family homes. Story 33. We had a chance in the United States, but people believed a convicted felon. Story 34. Why do you think it's not possible? I bought a house in 2023 while earning $55,000 a year. I only needed $15,000 in cash for a house priced at $258,000. Thanks to a state program that covered $10,000 of closing costs payable when the house is sold. I wish I had looked years earlier. I had no idea it was so affordable to buy a home. I thought I needed to have about $40,000 saved. It took me 3 years to save that $15,000. Story 35. Education. I know nothing about economics, but I do know that it is nearly impossible to get a good job without a halfway decent education. Story 36. 1. Increase housing supply. Remove zoning restrictions on single-family homes near large cities. Encourage mixed-use development through changes to property tax laws, and restrict private equity firms from buying up homes. 2. Make community colleges and in-demand trade programs public and tuition-free. 3. Implement a single-payer healthcare system. Healthcare is a major expense for the middle class and would be better publicly funded. Story 37. Large companies should be prevented from buying up private homes. Paying far above asking prices raises listing prices and perceived value and increases rents, which further inflates house prices. Banks should enforce stricter rules for monthly payments. The lack of meaningful first-time homebuyer tax relief is not the main cause, since buyers still need a down payment to qualify for rebates. Buyers are being priced out by predatory practices in the real estate market. For example, a house that cost $130,000 is now $280,000, needs $50,000 to $100,000 of repairs, and requires a $28,000 to $56,000 down payment plus $2,000 per month, while many people are struggling on $1,400 per month because of very high living costs. Story 38. The long-term answer is socialism, but while we work toward that, here are practical short-term solutions. 1. End suburban zoning codes that require each house to be a separate single-family dwelling. Medium-density neighborhoods, such as row houses, are more pleasant to live in. 2. Treat housing as a social good, not primarily as an investment. If housing is treated as an investment, only families should be allowed to benefit. Owning more than one home should incur a substantial penalty, and corporations should be barred from owning residential property. Story 39. Considering that more than half of 35-year-olds and almost exactly half of 30 to 34-year-olds own homes, I think it already is. Story 40. We have missed that boat, shot the captain, and hired a conman. We are swimming against the current by asking this question now. Story 41. Zoning reform that makes mixed-use residential development the standard. Waivers should be readily granted to convert unused office and retail space into housing, including empty shopping malls. Reform the Uniform Construction Code or the state's equivalent so builders can use newer materials and methods and are not required to install antiquated features. Implement rent control to keep rent affordable and help contain property values. Increase public housing construction. Establish a living wage. Strengthen landlord-tenant laws. Preventing large firms from using housing solely as an investment is difficult because they can create multiple subsidiaries to circumvent ownership limits. Story 42. When you start working, recognize the difference between wants and needs. Buy what you need and save wants until needs are met. You do not need a 65-inch television, ordering takeout 5 nights a week, a $1,000 phone, or a car with a $600 monthly payment. Have realistic expectations. Starter homes are okay. Homes that need work are okay. Watch video tutorials and learn how to do things. You do not need a brand new home. For new construction, costs are high because land, materials, and labor are expensive and unlikely to decrease. Reducing government regulation and permitting costs would help. Story 43. Is this not currently possible? I am sincerely asking because we are a middle-class household on one income and can easily afford a house. Story 44. Drop private mortgage insurance. The cost of the mortgage goes down significantly. Interest rates and inflation are other factors. Story 45. If people want to pay $125,000 or less for a move-in ready house, They need to move to a metro area or city that has one fewer cafe or bar they do not go to. Story 46. The root of every issue in the United States is money in politics. The Citizens United decision opened the floodgates. There is so much money floating around that the people's will and welfare are never the priority. No one will solve the affordability crisis because those who profit from high home prices have the means to block any legislation that is not in their interest. Story 47. Honestly, the whole property value nonsense from individual homeowners has to stop. There is no reason my house should have nearly doubled in value since 2011 while wages have not budged. You know how to make housing affordable? Lower the cost of housing. There is no reason homes should cost so much. We are in a generally low cost of living area, and new houses cost $400,000. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, that same house would have cost about $200,000. The problem now is people bought at inflated prices and cannot tolerate their property values going down. I did not buy my house to make a profit. I bought it because it was cheaper than rent. Astronomical house prices are half the problem, and homeowners complaining about falling property values are the other half. Story 48. Work remotely and either live in a very low cost of living area or stay with your parents for a couple of years to save 80 to 90% of your income for a down payment, repairs, and an emergency fund. Do not expect a mansion or an upscale city apartment. Be comfortable with an adequate 2 or 3 bedroom home in a modest suburb. Consider moving to a low cost of living state. It depends on how badly you want it. Story 49. We should gradually roll back free trade policies unless there is a compelling reason we cannot produce an item domestically. Outsourcing pollution does not make us greener. We need stronger union representation with sectoral bargaining for blue-collar and some white-collar jobs. Overhaul the temporary skilled worker visa program known as H-1B so migrant workers can move laterally between jobs within the country without an unnecessary sponsorship process. If you are qualified to work for one company, you should be able to move to another in a competitive market. Improve conditions and pay on farms and reduce reliance on migrant labor. Prevent multinational conglomerates from vertically integrating our supply chains by using protectionist policies and antitrust enforcement. Reframe what a good economy is and measure it using labor force participation, median income, unemployment and underemployment rates, and include the entire potential labor force. Reform welfare so that benefits do not disappear when people earn more. Benefits should phase out more slowly than income increases. Protect private sector low-skill workers and ensure there are jobs for all skill levels and levels of educational attainment. Finally, adopt public health care so businesses and individuals do not worry about paying for medical care when injured. Story 50. The not-so-simple solution is to move to an area that fits your employment and lifestyle, where housing is affordable. Story 51. Demolish old, largely vacant skyscrapers and replace them with homes above small businesses. Story 52. We need a change in values and priorities. Intangible things like friendship, community, and family should be valued more. Things made with quality and beauty should be valued more. People who do any job deserve respect, and those who do it well should be rewarded more. The way money works needs to change, in my opinion. Story 53. The last 60 years. Good luck with that. I think it is too late. The company that did this is not giving it back. Story 54. Limit residential single-family home ownership and possession to 3 units, including leases and similar arrangements. Eliminate the mortgage interest deduction. Story 55. More housing, particularly affordable housing, including row houses, triplexes, and condominiums. Story 56. Inflation has far outpaced the rise in salaries and hourly wages. People cannot afford a house because much more of their income goes toward other expenses. Healthcare, student debt, and the rising cost of owning a car have all increased dramatically, leaving less money available to save for a home. Story 57. You must learn that you will be better off if others are also better off. Story 58. Cynically redefine the middle class as those who can. That pivots the problem to expanding the middle class. Familiar talking points like shrinking middle class remain true enough. It is a realistic political hoodwink because it minimizes the issue and assigns less blame. What needs to happen? Package it with the next infrastructure bill. You know what? For lack of a better term, make infrastructure bills great again. Story 59. A lot needs to change. First, property prices need to come down. Land supply is fixed, so land prices are very sensitive to demand spikes and land use regulations. Economists, city planners, and industry experts agree that the biggest drivers of property prices are zoning laws and excessive regulation that choke new construction. The specifics of how to address this are debatable, but comprehensive, nationwide reform of housing construction regulation is required. Preventing investment companies from buying homes or taxing extra properties alone will not solve the underlying problem. Second, wages need to rise. There are three components to this problem. The first is excessive friction in the labor market. In many communities, people complain about how hard it is to find suitable jobs, but employers often face similar difficulties finding qualified candidates. Job postings and qualification requirements should be brought to a unified national standard across as many fields as possible, and the job search process should be regulated. Fake job postings should be illegal, and there should be large investments in retraining and placement programs. The second is education. Education costs are spiraling partly because demand is falling. College attendance peaked around 2010 and has declined since, and the long-term trend in attendance growth has slowed for decades. Colleges cannot respond to decreased demand by cutting amenities and prestige the way other businesses cut costs, because reputation drives applicant behavior. Many applicants will not consider cheaper institutions that lack perceived prestige or on-campus services. As a result, colleges compete by investing in facilities, conveniences, prestige, research programs, and high-profile faculty, which raises prices. The only long-term fix is a cultural shift in how society values higher education. Until then, heavy public subsidies funded by higher taxes on top earners can reduce the burden on lower and middle-income students. But subsidies have limits and do not stop the prestige arms race. This is mostly damage control until cultural values change. The third is healthcare costs. Productivity has increased while wages have lagged, but overall compensation has risen because of rapidly increasing healthcare costs. Employers pay higher insurance premiums, and every rise in those premiums reduces the portion of compensation workers can negotiate as wages. Healthcare prices are driven by large providers' bargaining power with insurers, frequent use of costly tests and procedures, and referral practices that limit patient choice. Pharmaceutical price gouging matters in some cases, but generics mitigate much of that effect. Clinician and hospital behavior and anti-competitive practices are often larger factors. Insurers often work to restrain costs by negotiating on behalf of many consumers. Without insurance, prices can skyrocket, creating a system where insured patients benefit from collective bargaining while uninsured patients face extreme bills. Other policy changes could help. Lower corporate taxes would help more if labor market frictions were fixed, but would do little otherwise. Replacing property taxes with land value taxes could help if implemented prudently. Reducing the cost of building materials by deregulating forestry and energy could lower housing costs, but would trade lower housing prices for increased environmental damage. Unions matter, but they are not a cure-all. Effective unions protect workers and raise wages, but unaccountable unions can harm industries and shield bad behavior. Regulations should prevent unions from protecting employees against termination for cause, such as sexual harassment, while empowering unions to negotiate for wage increases. Unions should also be required to compete for membership in ways that avoid free rider problems and ensure accountability. In conclusion, much needs to change across housing regulation, labor market structure, education financing, healthcare costs, and related policies. These reforms together would help address the underlying problems driving high prices and stagnant wages. Story 60. The cost of building new housing must fall relative to income. While it remains so expensive, natural expansion cannot occur. Story 61. More homes and lower interest rates. Give a homestead credit equal to half of the property taxes to the occupants of a primary residence rather than to the property owner. Story 62. It is all about quantity. That makes it an unattractive asset class for investors. Story 63. There is no single answer. First, a portion of the inventory of existing homes has been taken off the market for various reasons, including short-term rentals, corporations and individuals buying and holding properties as assets while waiting for appreciation, and an increase in second homes. Low interest rates have facilitated this, and even if rates rise, that missing inventory will not reappear quickly. Second, the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic slowed down elderly people downsizing into retirement and nursing homes. Third, new construction has never fully rebounded nationwide since the real estate crash of 2008. Fourth, later life marriage and divorce mean more people live alone than in previous decades, increasing the need for housing units. Fifth, location matters. There are many areas in the United States with affordable housing, but that does not mean you can do the same work there or that you will want to live there. Story 64. Increase the value of the United States dollar. Eliminate single-family real estate holding companies. Prohibit foreign businesses from owning real estate. Increase taxes on secondary single-family homes. Story 65. Issue more building permits. Relax building codes. Encourage alternative structures such as modular and mobile homes. They are not perfect, but they are ideal for some people. Consider more mobile home parks with condominium ownership, where each resident owns a stake in the land and can vote on dues and lot rent increases. Impose strict limits on Airbnb and short-term rentals. Houses and condos were not designed to function as hotels and neighborhoods were not zoned for hotel use. Consider a vacancy tax, but design enforcement carefully to be efficient and fair. Story 66. Many more homes need to be built. Single-family homes, not 1,300 square foot condominiums and townhouses. Story 67. Follow the guidelines of the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank, and the Brookings Institution, a liberal think tank. Graduate from high school, and do not have children until you are married. Get a stable job that allows you to earn a good income over several years, for example at a company like Costco, and marry someone who does the same. This should result in an annual household income of $80,000 to $100,000 after several years of hard work, with little to no debt. Also, do not set your sights on living in Seattle, San Francisco, or New York. Story 68. Universal single-payer healthcare. Medicare for all with sliding scale copayments. No more medical bills piling up for working families. Story 69. Removing profits from the housing market. There is no reason other than speculation and greed that owning versus renting should not be financially equal. People piling into the real estate market hoping to get rich in 25 to 30 years, when investments in the stock market are statistically better, helps explain why demand never slows. Stopping landlords from extracting every penny from everyone would relieve the pressure to move from renting to owning. Profits are to blame. Story 70. The solution I see is less regulation. One of the biggest drivers of the housing crisis is zoning. Major cities zone too much land for single-family homes, which has driven up the price of apartments and lower-income housing. Story 71. No corporate ownership of residential property. Encourage high-rise residential towers. Remove barriers to in-law units, duplexes, and triplexes. Story 72. We have to stop letting the United States government bail out businesses and the stock market. The middle class is losing real opportunities to make money on the stock market. Follow along as I use real-world evidence. Delta Airlines' lowest stock purchase price in 2020 was $19.19. At the time of writing, it is valued at $61.05 per share. When the stock was $19.19, the company had been valued at less than $4 per share and was headed toward bankruptcy. In that same period, the United States government passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, providing tens of billions of dollars to each airline, followed by additional payments in loans, ultimately saving the company from its worst point in history. In a theoretical purchase, an investor with $10,000 used all of it to buy shares at $19.19 per share, leaving him with about 521 shares. If he sold them now at the current price, he would have an additional $21,807.05. for a total of $31,807.05. Before assuming the worst-case scenario of $4 per share, the company's assets alone were worth more than that valuation, and large investors would likely have bought substantial blocks of Delta Airlines stock at that price. Never mind that it was during the coronavirus pandemic and that conditions would almost certainly improve. If the share price had fallen to $4 per share and new owners later performed as well as the airline has since that time, that same $10,000 purchase would have bought 2,500 shares. At the current price, those shares would be worth $152,625. To be honest, many middle-class people have more than $10,000 in savings. Taking that into account makes this problem more apparent. Stop bailing out corporations. There are many other factors holding back the middle class. But each time the government bails out automakers or airlines, it harms the middle class significantly. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act did do some good, but none of U.S. could expect to be bailed out by the government in the same way. The only thing that would have supported affected employees would be unemployment benefits, which is what airline employees would have received until the pandemic eased and life could resume. This does not even mention how much those bailouts contribute to inflation. Story 73. House? Not happening. There is simply not enough land with adequate real estate value. The best way forward is to provide mid- or high-density housing that matches the quality of a house. Story 74. Local governments should have a dramatically reduced ability to impose zoning laws on developers. A simple residential, commercial, or industrial designation is sufficient. Remove density requirements and minimum lot sizes. This is a supply and demand problem. You cannot reduce demand, so you must increase supply. Story 75. A national building cooperative. Hands-on, Jimmy Carter style. Story 76. People need to be willing to move to where there is more housing. Story 77. End welfare for corporations and wealthy individuals. Implement a single gross income tax if your combined income from all wages, capital gains, and private gains used to cover living expenses exceeds $1 million per year. Create additional tax brackets that approach a 100% tax rate as your gross income per year approaches $10 billion. For a stable economy, the middle class needs to hold the majority of wealth in society. It is that simple. When the middle class holds the most wealth, they will be able to afford housing and other basic necessities. Story 78. Wages must rise and prices must fall. Both can be achieved by changing laws that allow corporations to hoard property and wealth. Story 79. Most necessary actions will not be taken because of money hoarders and capitalist sycophants. Story 80. I understand why people want to build homes in many places, but not everyone can live in rural areas because there are no suitable jobs there. If we solved the housing problem so people could afford to live in the cities where they work, it would significantly reduce traffic. One solution would be to prohibit corporations from owning residential homes and to cap how many homes a person can own. There should also be limits on rentals so landlords do not benefit from keeping housing scarce. These changes would put more houses on the market and lower prices. A remaining concern is property taxes. I am not sure how people who retire or stop working would afford property taxes. Not everyone can live in an apartment. We should stop building so many apartments if they are often more expensive than renting a house. Story 81. Working from home and decentralizing offices can help. There simply is not enough land near a city center for everyone who works in the city to own a home and commute to the center in a reasonable time. Avoiding purchases by renting or staying out of the housing market might help. Temporarily, but it only buys a few years, maybe a decade, before supply and demand make home prices unaffordable for anyone who did not secure a home earlier. Allowing people not to cluster around a metropolitan area will do more to facilitate homeownership than any short-term measure. Story 82. Regulation. The free market with no regulation eventually leads to the rise of a single corporation that becomes the beneficiary of all. It is what we are seeing in late-stage capitalism worldwide. Only direct intervention by governments to control the wealthy and opportunists can achieve equity. Story 83. I think this will upset people, but 1. We need more people in households with no working members to join the workforce. They are already buying things, but their lack of contribution to producing goods or providing services drives prices up. 2. We need more money circulating in the United States rather than being sent out of the United States. Productive immigrants are acceptable if they are not sending money back home. 3. We need more creative destruction. People losing jobs and then moving into activities that make the economy more efficient, producing more with less labor. If done seamlessly, people earn more, but there are switching costs that we could help reduce. 4. We need more investment in the United States. A workforce with more and better equipment and useful education, not gender studies, produces more efficiently. 5. Specific to home buying, we need to encourage more housing construction. More houses mean lower prices. This is partly due to lower interest rates, but there are other factors, and we should consider policies that help home builders feel more secure and make it easier to build new homes. Story 84. Interest rates must rise. People do not understand how the wealthy use cheap loans to bid up all asset classes. We should impose a tax on any property beyond a person's first home, with the tax rate rising exponentially for each additional home. This would make holding large portfolios of homes economically infeasible. Story 85. City councils should stop approving 10 times more office space for white-collar workers than the number of new homes they approve for those workers to live in. When artificially constrained supply meets inflated demand, it is only natural that workers with more disposable income are willing to pay more to live closer to work. Alternatively, city residents will need to compromise and live in higher density housing, such as townhomes that use space vertically, and forego single-family homes with quarter-acre lots. With 131 million households in the United States, there is not enough space in the most desirable places, so people will need to compromise on cost, home footprint, or location. Story 86. Overhaul property taxes. The first home would be heavily subsidized. The second home would face higher standard taxation. Every additional home would be progressively taxed more heavily. Property owners could reduce their tax burden for each unit occupied by a Section 8 housing assistance tenant. This would allow owners of luxury apartments to accept low-income tenants to remain financially viable and would discourage corporate landlords from hoarding properties they cannot fill. Provide grants to rebuild uninhabitable houses. Many homes are not in a condition for a family to live in, so the government should use the additional revenue from higher taxes to fund reconstruction. Story 87. Fees, taxes, and stamps needed during the purchasing process. Story 88. I will share 3 things as a 27-year-old who bought my first house. First, wages compared to prices. I could not have done it alone. My wonderful fiancé worked hard with me to make it happen. Second, mindset. Negativity holds you back and the law of attraction is real. Third, people and banks buying houses. Individuals buying properties to rent and corporations buying in large numbers are driving up prices. Story 89. Housing costs, including mortgage payments and rent, are a percentage of the mean wage in the United States, with rent generally representing a smaller share. Story 90. My daughter, at the age of 24, purchased a house in Philadelphia as a single person on a registered nurse salary of about $65,000. This was around 2005, and she did so without any financial assistance from me. She bought a car in 2019. She is now married, and her home is worth over $500,000. She has a bachelor's degree and no student loans. She paid them off herself. She also has over $200,000 in savings. Her husband is also a registered nurse. Can be done. Story 91. I am not a historian, but what is happening right now has occurred many times throughout history. If you live long enough, you might be alive when things swing back to us, the peasants. Story 92. If we deport the promised millions of immigrants, there will be a glut of empty housing. After the economy collapses because those workers are sorely missed, part of the recovery will focus on getting those homes off the market. So survive the recession and avoid dying in a poorly managed pandemic, and you should be in a great position to buy. Story 93. Union organizing, prohibiting investors from buying single-family homes, and banning Airbnb in cities. Story 94. Take this nation back from unlimited competition, where the people most rewarded are usually the most ruthless and unsympathetic and already have more than they will ever need. Fuck the oligarchs who have taken this country from us. Story 95. This comment will probably be buried because it's too late, but the housing market would quickly fall and then stabilize if the Federal Reserve removed the floor from under the market. Story 96. Increase supply. Build more. While wage increases are beneficial, they will not help if supply is low. Prices will simply rise. Story 97. The working class is your target. If more of them are like you, you are probably working class. Story 98. Most areas were affordable for the middle class 4 years ago, but only because of the crash of 2008. If you want property to be affordable again, you need to remove incentives for property as an investment, also known as tax deductions, and allow the bottom to fall out without government intervention. Story 99. Honestly, the country has to correct the wealth gap. I voted for Kamala, but I will benefit far more from tax incentives under Trump because of my tax bracket. Trump did a phenomenal job convincing the working class that his economic policies would work for them, but realistically they helped the top 1%, not the working class. Story 100. Increasing taxes on the 1% and improving labor laws are the opposite of what is about to happen. Story 101. Not a Trump or Harris administration, that's for sure. We need a government that broadly works for the working class, rather than for corporate donors. Every election is either a band-aid or another gaping wound. We need better leadership. Story 102. Reduce the labor supply. If half the population were to leave the job market, demand for the remaining workers would drive up wages and likely help society in other ways as well. Concentrating on raising a family and being decent homemakers would solve quite a few societal ills. Story 103. Apart from the pandemic disrupting things, people need to be more motivated to pursue an actual career. I am a single, full-time dad, and I was able to buy not one but 2 homes in the last decade while in my 30s. Story 104. The idiots who vote need to recognize that a vote for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is a vote for the status quo or worse. You are voting for Wall Street and corporate interests first and foremost. Your health, happiness, and prosperity are 27th on their list of priorities. Story 105. Pay people more. Minimum wage should be about $26 per hour. Then even a couple working minimum wage jobs would have a chance. Story 106. Eliminate for-profit housing and healthcare. Story 107. Our salaries should match inflation. Based on multiple online calculators, entry-level positions should pay at least $200,000 per year to keep up with inflation since the 1970s. Story 108. That's not the plan. The United States of corporations intends to own everything, and we would just pay to use it. The only way I see to change this is to make it illegal for corporate entities to own single-family homes. That's not going to happen. Story 109. 1. Apply the same rules to overseas ownership of property as apply when buying property in the owner's home country. Thailand. Own the building but not the land. China. Foreigners cannot freehold own land. Japan, no problem. And so on. 2. Ban or impose a super tax on local ownership of more than one place of residence, unless family members live there permanently. This will allow parents to buy housing and rent to their children if they can afford it, and allow extended families to pool money to buy homes until everyone has their own place. 3. Eliminate gift tax limits for transfers used to buy a home, and increase the capital gains taxable holding period from 12 months to 3 years for all new owners. This will reduce property flipping and help keep housing available and affordable for first-time and low-income buyers. 4. Count rental history and bond payments toward the capacity to pay for a home loan. Currently, high rent can prevent people from qualifying for a mortgage even though they can afford similar payments. 5. Support economically viable caravan and cabin parks with tax and rates breaks for owners. Owners are often offered large payouts to subdivide land used for caravan parks and drive-in movie lots. But once developed, those subdivisions become unaffordable for former residents. Encouraging affordable caravan and cabin parks could reduce homelessness by providing roofs over people's heads for about $150 per week rather than much higher current costs. I think that could be a start. Story 110. Remove incentives for people to hoard housing inventory and use it as rentals. Impose a monetary penalty so high that they are forced to sell. Story 111. The ship has sailed. The only way to fix it is a massive wage adjustment, but that will take years to achieve. Story 112. End commission-based pay for real estate agents, which raises housing prices dramatically. Story 113. Mandating in-office work for jobs that can be done remotely. Amazon recently told employees they must go to the office every day, even though that is not necessary for many of them. This forces employees to buy housing near job centers and drives up housing prices near workplaces. Story 114. This is a strange request after the election. Realistically, I think the middle class is gone. Story 115. I can't believe how ignorant people are. Do you all choose to be ignorant? Or were you born that way? It's not a housing issue. It's a money issue. There are plenty of houses. You just cannot afford them. Before Ronald Reagan, wealth distribution in this country produced a large and relatively prosperous middle class. Republicans somehow convinced average workers that more money in their bosses' pockets would be better for them. And it continues today, with billionaires convincing everyone that their interests are the public's interests. This man literally has the richest person in the world behind him, jumping up in the air and cheering him on. Keep drinking the Kool-Aid, suckers. Story 116. Eliminate corporate ownership. Rezone land for high-density housing. Remove excessively large parking lots nationwide and eliminate the infamous Strode-type commercial avenues unique to the United States. Make cities more walkable. Story 117. This is not an American issue. It is an international issue. Nearly every developed country is facing the same housing problems. In Canada, municipalities charge what I consider absurd development fees. In Toronto, the fee is currently about $60,000 for a condo and $100,000 for a house before the developer puts a shovel in the ground. There are also many other costs. Who has a vested interest in lower prices? Mostly people who do not own a home or who are in the process of buying one. The moment a buyer moves into a home, their preference usually shifts toward higher prices. Insurance companies benefit from higher home values because premiums rise. Municipal and local governments collect more property tax on expensive homes and often spend it poorly. Banks can lend more and for longer terms on higher-priced homes. While not risk-free, they are able to foreclose and resell if borrowers cannot pay. Real estate agents earn more selling expensive properties for the same amount of work and often lack a long-term interest in a buyer's or seller's financial well-being. This is why agents historically make more money when selling their own properties, where they have a true vested interest. Raising interest rates used to cool the housing market, but that is less effective now. The race to the lowest rates in developed nations makes it harder for people on fixed incomes to earn a safe passive return. Those who expected to live on fixed income now have fewer investment options and often move money into the stock market, which pushes asset prices higher. People also take out home equity to invest in the market. All of these factors combine to create a very frothy market with little sign of cooling and many risks. I believe housing prices will get worse before they get better, in part because of the large wealth transfer expected from older generations to younger ones. The constant struggle over responsibilities between state and federal governments makes broad, effective policy unlikely. In Canada, capital gains taxes apply to rental properties but not to primary, owner-occupied residences, and that has not cooled the market. Increasing purpose-built rental housing could help, but private industry is unlikely to take on that financial burden, and governments generally have a poor track record with large housing projects. My number one piece of advice: don't be poor or middle class, be rich. Story 118. Reduce red tape and costs to build more housing. Story 119. More affordable housing is being built and expectations are lower. Here in the Dallas and Fort Worth area, we have some Lennar and D.R. Horton homes in the low $200,000 range. They are fine, modest homes, but most middle-class people think they deserve better than that. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.